Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Rothschild, and I'm the Director of Constituent Relations at the University of Virginia's Medical Alumni Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's event, How the Human Brain Evolved, with Dr. Jim Mandel and Dr. Brett Stetka. Today's webinar is being recorded and closed captioning is available for this event. We'll begin the program shortly with Dr. Jim Mandel posing some questions to Dr. Brett Stetka, as every good mentor does. We'll leave time at the end of the program for your questions, including those that were pre-submitted. You're welcome to submit questions throughout today's program using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll address as many questions as we can. I'd like to invite Dr. Mandel and Dr. Stetka to join me on camera at this time so I may introduce them. Dr. Jim Mandel is a professor of neuropathology at the University of Virginia, where he has served on faculty since 1998 with roles in clinical diagnostics, basic laboratory research, and teaching. His clinical interests cover all of surgical neuropathology, including histopathologic diagnosis of brain tumors and other disorders of the brain, spinal cord, nerve, muscle, and eye. He also serves on the Neuropathology Autopsy Service, which entails postmortem diagnosis of neurodegenerative disorders, among others. Dr. Brett Stetka is an editorial director at Medscape.com, the professional division of WebMD.com. He is a non-practicing physician, a freelance health and science journalist for a variety of print and online publications, and a graduate of the University of Virginia School of Medicine. He is now a regular contributor to NPR, as well as Scientific American magazine, where he writes about neuroscience, psychiatry, and evolution. His work has also appeared in Wired and Men's Journal, as well as Slate, Popular Mechanics, and The Atlantic. Dr. Mandel, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you for this opportunity. But before I start this discussion, I just want to mention something. I was in a thesis committee yesterday, and one of my colleagues said, "Jim, congratulations on your book." And I said, "Whoa, no, this is not my book. This is Brett Stetka's book, 110%. I guess he read the subject line, nothing else. So this is really about Brett and this amazing book that I've enjoyed reading over the past couple of weeks. And it's a great pleasure to reconnect with Brett. We're friends and colleagues. Brett was in my laboratory as a medical student, and I really enjoyed having him and his ideas. So I'm going to start the conversation by asking, well, first of all, saying that there's a great tradition of physician writers, from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to Michael Crichton, now more recently Atul Gawande. And what inspired you to take that non-traditional route out of medical school to become a medical writer?
Sure. And to start, I just want to thank you, Jim, for participating in this, and thank UVA and the Alumni Society and the med school for having me. This is very exciting. And I think I still have your Wilco CD, Jim, so I will get that back.
I thought I had all of them. Okay, you got one.
And I think I owe you a paper on multiple sclerosis as well. So I'll try to get those back to you this year. I was kind of conflicted, as you may remember. I planned on going into neurology when I got to UVA's medicine, and then I ended up loving psychiatry, and then I ended up loving research. I did research in a lab or two prior to yours, but then once I got to your lab, I just I loved it. I think most of my fourth year I was in your lab, studying MS and the Schick protein, if I remember, and so I was torn. So I didn't enter the residency match, and instead decided I got accepted into a Mount Sinai postdoc for biological psychiatry. So studying the effects of resveratrol or red wine in mice, in a Alzheimer's model in a rodent Alzheimer's model, really. And you helped me get into that. You wrote me a recommendation, and it ended up being really, really fun. I think I got 3 or 4 publications out of it, and just realized that I liked really writing about science. It kind of tapped into my creative side and the scientific side. I've always loved music, and then I needed money, so I applied for a job at WebMD after a few freelance jobs, and ended up with this editorial position at Medscape, thinking I'd probably go back and intermatch the next year and do a residency or try to do a PhD and be a researcher. And I just really loved keeping up with medicine and the science and writing about it. And, another year passed, I was still doing that, and it just felt right. And now it's been 14 years and I don't practice, but I love keeping up with medicine and trying to translate that to people through, through writing.
I think that's a really wonderful role and an important one, because so many practicing physicians probably don't have enough time to keep up with the latest journal articles. And you read, and I know you go to a lot of conferences and distill that for psychiatrists and neurologists and others.
I think that's I think that's the role that science journalists have, is that it's hard to keep up with everything as a doctor, as you know. I mean, my friends from UVA Med School are focused on stroke or Parkinson's, and that's really all they can know because there's so much in their fields. So they know a lot about one thing, and I know a little about a lot of things. Like I have to keep up with MS and Alzheimer's and stroke, but you wouldn't want me treating you, but I know all the the studies and like where where the science is, generally speaking, to try to get it out to the public or even to doctors. So yeah, it's just a different approach that I hadn't planned on, but I'm enjoying it so far.
Wonderful. The next question will be about evolution. So I loved my courses in my undergraduate education about evolution, but they were taught by professors of philosophy. And when I got into medical school, the word evolution really almost never popped up. I've been looking in all my books on the shelf, my pathology, neuropathology, neuroscience books. If you look in the index, which has thousands of listings, the word evolution isn't in there. It's not part of our education or our culture for the most part. So why did you decide to write a book about the evolution of the brain when you're really a professional writer about medicine?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've noticed that lately, at least, at Medscape, we interview a lot of academic doctors, psychiatrists, and neurologists, and I've seen it popping up more recently, just sort of a Darwinian look at disease and things like that. But I don't remember really being taught anything about evolution in med school, and I probably because it's not practical. I mean, I get that it's not going to save anybody's life, and it's probably meant for a PhD program in evolutionary biology. But I've always found it really interesting since probably high school. I started reading people like Stephen Jay Gould and Darwin, and my dad was a geneticist, so he had mentioned evolution and Darwin over the years. And I read Kurt Vonnegut's Galapagos, which is a novel, but it still got me interested in evolution. And so I've just kept up with that over the years, and anthropology as well. So when I got approached to write a book, an agent asked me if I had an idea, and they'd been following my writing at Medscape and Scientific American, and I said I don't have any ideas at all. I have nothing for it. And but then I had just read a couple books about the heart, one by Sandeep Juhar, who's a cardiologist, just on how we came to understand how the heart works. And I just researched, has anyone ever done that about the brain for a lay audience, for the public? And really, they hadn't. There have been a few, academic books. And so I just went to my agent and publisher and said, what if I just wrote the history of the brain? I don't know if that's been done, really. And, for better or for worse, they bought it. So I had to write it, but I was very excited because as you know, I've loved the brain like you do, and incredibly interested in how it evolved. So I put together my interest in medicine, evolution, anthropology, and which was a lot to fit into 260 pages, but it was a fun challenge.
It's a daunting challenge, I think.
It was very daunting.
I wouldn't know where to start. And I guess my preface is, if everyone says the human brain is complex, some people say the most complex object in the known universe, although maybe whale brain is as complex or more so. We don't know.
You would know better than me.
It's certainly bigger than ours.
It's bigger.
But I mean, you'll like to talk about the parts list of the brain. It's 15 billion or more neurons, equal numbers or greater of the supporting glial cells, 100,000 miles of axons, 100 trillion synapses between neurons, which, this is now we're getting better than Carl Sagan with his billions. We're talking trillions. And
Amazing.
it's daunting to, and that's just the parts list. And then the wiring diagram, which we don't really understand yet, just partially, and the
Right.
function. So to write about the evolution of something we barely understand is a daunting project, but I'm glad you did it anyway.
Well, thank you. I mean, you probably should have been the one to do it, but thank you. And the yeah, I mean, I feel personally like the brain and or the universe itself are the most complicated entities that exist. So that's part of why I probably went into neurology in the first place and then turned into a neuroscience writer.
Wonderful. I just want to say that I really enjoyed the book, and I really recommend all the audience members to get a copy. It's not a hard read. It's actually a lot of fun, because your style is very light, enjoyable, actually humorous. I'm going to read a couple lines that I put on my note list just to, so when you describe the evolutionary explosion of diverse animal forms in the Cambrian era, where they had all these bizarre creatures in the ocean floor, and you said it was like that space cantina in Star Wars. So that brought to very good image in my mind of the bizarreness of life forms. And you talked about the evolutionary tinkering of organisms rather than a plan or a design. And you likened that, as a good writer does, with an analogy to a very old building that's been plumbed and then replumbed over the course of centuries. The architecture of a madman, a cobbling together of bygone lead pipes, a corroded mid-century copper connected to modern PVC. The structure isn't pretty or predictable, but it still works. I thought that was well put.
Thank you. Thank you.
And one more, I'm going to give one more funny quote to try to sell you more copies.
Thank you.
And you described the massive extinction of the marine species during the Permian period, around 250 million years ago. And you say the armored Cambrian spokesperson, the trilobite, was gone for good, relegated to future tchotchke and fossil shops. So I got a chuckle. And the writing is fun, and I highly recommend it. I finished it pretty quickly, which is unusual for me.
Well, that's incredibly nice to hear, Jim. Thank you very much. I mean, that was my intention, was to, because when I signed on to write the history of the brain, two days later, I realized this is a stupid idea. This is this is too much to do in the time I was given. So it became a fun challenge to really go back 3.5 billion years and just kind of give an overarching of how the brain probably got here, but make it fun. So hopefully it's not just for scientists or doctors or people interested in the brain, but just people with a general interest in science who might read, the New York Times or the New Yorker science section. And yeah, so I tried to make it as fun as possible. And sometimes I would slide back into medical journalism and it would get a little dry, and I'd go back and say, oh, there's too many neurotransmitters in this paragraph. I have to get rid of a few. So that was a fun challenge. But yeah, I appreciate that. It was, that I really wanted it to be accessible and fun, knowing that I would have to squeeze in a lot of, of science, that some people probably just would find boring, but hopefully I did it in an engageable way. And that really was the challenge. And I wish I had 5 more months to write the book, because I did, it was tough to do all that research so quickly, but it was a fun challenge. I'm glad it turned out how it did. And I appreciate the kind words. Book sales aside, thank you for the kind words.
I enjoyed it. Speaking of the research, was most of this done pre-pandemic, and did the pandemic impact on your ability to interact with scientists around the world?
The majority was done pre-pandemic. I had actually turned the first draft in before COVID hit. So anything in person in the book, I visited a number of well-known anthropologists and biologists, like Ralph Holloway and Richard Wrangham, and but then I got COVID hit, and it delayed the release of the book a little bit, and I had to do all of my edits during the pandemic, and from our cabin upstate with really bad Wi-Fi and no cell phone service. So it was interesting, but I did a handful of follow-up interviews over the phone or over Zoom to kind of fill in the gaps, which was fun. And I didn't even know this, but my publishers, some publishers still do the edits on actual paper. So I got a FedEx with 200 pages, and I had to go through it with a pen, and I have terrible penmanship, and I warned them about that. So I was as doctors do, I suppose. And so yeah, I spent 3 months of COVID, really. I mean, except for my work at Medscape. I mean, that's what my day job. But on the weekends, I would just sit there with a pen and my papers and do it, and do follow-up interviews and email interviews and things like that. So it was a bit of both, but luckily a lot of it was done prior to COVID.
Wonderful. So I guess I'll dig into some of the questions that came up in reading. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not an evolutionary biologist. I'm just very fascinated.
Nor am I. Nor am I.
Good. So I think we can relate to most of the audience who probably aren't evolutionary biologists.
Well, that's a good point, because one challenge in this book was I, from the get-go, I knew I was pretty sure that I was going to get flack from every single field that I covered, because I took on such a wide range. And what I know about is basically neurology and psychiatry. So I figured the evolutionary biologists would come up, like they'd find something wrong, the anthropologists would find something wrong, and they still might. People have been very kind, but I knew that it's more a general story of the brain, trying to convey that, knowing that I don't know every study in evolutionary biology about this, this mammalian bone in your cheek, but I get a general sense of how mammals evolved. And so that was another challenge. And people have been kind, but I'm still expecting a little something from the real academics out there.
I hope they're not too harsh. I think it deserves reading by all people of different
Thank you.
roles, lay and scientists. But let's start. Actually, I'll start from in the prologue. You open up with a scene of psychiatrists eating oysters. Why did you decide to open up the book with that? What's the rationale?
That was actually, honestly, like the impetus for the book was probably that, which is odd. So I was for Medscape, as you mentioned, I cover a lot of neurology and psychiatry meetings as a writer, but more as an editor. So I'll go to the meetings and assign stories, and also just to learn about what's going on in both fields. And so I was at the American Psychiatry Association's meeting in 2015, 16. And there was this, I was walking through the hallways very early in the morning, and there was this massive scrum of people, hundreds of people trying to get into this one session. And I finally got in, and it was called, it was basically called brain nutrition, brain diet, something around what foods are best for the brain. And it was two psychiatrists, Drew Ramsey from Columbia, Emily Deans from Harvard, basically going through what dietary patterns are best for our brain. And they kind of got into the evolutionary theories behind it. And so when I got asked to write the book, that was in the back of my head as being this momentous moment, mostly because it was about 7 in the morning, I think. And I walked in, and Drew Ramsey, the psychiatrist who I'm now good friends with, had a plate of raw oysters on ice and was handing them out to this whole row of psychiatrists. And I joke in the book about watching Brian dribble down a bunch of beards at 7 in the morning. It's not the most pleasant thing. Psychiatrists often have beards. And it was everyone was slurping these oysters in an incredibly early hour. And then I sat through a 3-hour discussion that was so good and so interesting about, how our brains got here in terms of nutrition and marine nutrients, and why seafood is still good for the brain, and omega-3s and things like that. And so, I covered that session for Medscape 5 years ago, and it just got me thinking about how did the brain get here, and what were the influences that got it here, evolutionary, in a Darwinian sense. And so I knew that nutrition would be one of them, our diets and fire and meat versus seafood. But then I hadn't thought about it in a long time. And then when I got the book deal, that really was an inspiration to really dive into what other influences led to our big primate ape brains. But yeah, it was that morning session with those oysters that I think is why this book exists.
Unlikely connection, but cool.
Completely, yeah.
So a sort of fundamental question about evolution and evolutionary biologists. I remember this from my undergraduate years, that experimentalists, of course, who have a laboratory with cells in a dish or animal models or analyzing human specimens, often criticize the evolutionary biologists who come up with stories, basically, and the term "just so" story was used as a critique of some of these, meaning, you have a trait or a feature, and in brain, of course, it's about processing information and adapting to environmental change, and then you can come up with a story for that, and without doing any experiments. And then I guess one example that I read about, and you mentioned in the book, is that the idea that as our brains expanded to allow better adaptability to environmental changes and tool use and different abilities, then we had to have a way that big head could pass through the birth canal, and the suture idea that it can fold and collapse slightly without hurting that newborn brain. And the story would be that was an evolutionary trait that allowed bigger brains at birth that could grow even more. And then other critics would say, well, actually, you can find sutures in some egg-laying creatures. So I don't,
Sure.
So what do evolutionary biologists say about their stories? And do they claim to make testable hypotheses?
So I found a couple different tiers of this. So if I talk to a data-driven biologist, they would be critical of the evolutionary biologist that's coming up with ideas. Even someone like Stephen Jay Gould, one of the most famous evolutionary biologists. A lot of work is speculation, and the data experimental scientists, I don't want to say disrespect, but they look down on it a little bit. And then I'd talk to any biologist, and they would criticize the anthropologist for coming up with completely speculative stories about where we came from, and we're eating fish on this shore and that saved us. And so I cover all of that in I'm trying to put it all together, all the different opinions. But I completely agree. So with that example, with the fontanelle and the suture example, so that actually came from a couple of anthropologists. That's more of an anthropology theory, and I totally agree. There are, in doing research, there's sutures, there's fontanelles in creatures that don't have a brain as big as ours. The one thing that everyone seemed to agree on in fields of anthropology, evolutionary biology, was that because our brain is so disproportionately big for our body size, our encephalization quotient is how they measure it, that's the term, that we definitely had to be born earlier. That was our evolutionary sort of workaround for selection on intelligence and a big brain. So we do come out of the womb so much earlier than most other animals, developmentally speaking, just because the pelvis can only get so big and the birth canal can only get so big to birth a brain and still have a female be able to walk around and function. So there's a couple of things there. There's the fact that we were born earlier because we did have a disproportionately large brain, and then also being early in our development for years. We have this incredibly long childhood and adolescence compared to any other creature, except for chimpanzees. Our close cousins come close. So we're taking in all these environmental cues and environmental stimulations and things that really help us develop and learn social intelligence and how to interact socially, how to interact with our environment. So it was almost twofold. We had to come out early because selection was acting on us being intelligent, but then it also benefited us in that if our parents were around or we had some way of surviving for 12 years until we were on our own, the environment really shaped our brain and still does. So that's how I saw it. But I completely agree that so many stories in biology and anthropology are speculation. They're great stories. They make for good papers, and they're probably partially true, but who knows if
it can be hypotheses. I mean, a story is a hypothesis that could, in theory, be tested, I think.
Sure. Yeah. Well, like the idea, I think I read a lot about how shellfish may have saved us. And that was one anthropologist's theory that, we had a population bottleneck about 150,000 years ago where humans almost went extinct. And other anthropologists and biologists say, well, that population almost went extinct. There are probably other groups of us around Africa that didn't. And then they happened to find all these shellfish near that one particular population. So sure, probably we figured out how to track tides and at least a small group of us survived. But does that mean that it saved our species? It's hard to say, even though that's the story that some tell. And I mean, I tell it to a degree, so.
So from the point of view of hard data in evolutionary neuroscience, a lot of it is based on indirect, so skull size, for example, we have a lot of fossils. People
Right.
who study the evolution of the skeletal system are in great shape. They have all kinds of interesting bones to compare and measure and quantify and show beautiful phylogenetic or evolutionary trees. But for brain, we're left with pretty much skull size and a hole that they think a brain occupied. There's no fossil record of any brain parts or synapses or neurons, as you know.
Yep.
So what did you learn about? I mean, a lot of the old literature is just mapping brain, skull size, brain size to body size and so on.
Yep.
What did you learn about that, and how are scientists going beyond that as the one hard fact about brain evolution?
The one of the big things I learned was that, yeah, until we had genetic data, this was all measured by literally pouring beans into fossilized skulls. And in Neanderthals and early humans and or early sapiens, and just comparing, how many beans fit inside of a skull in our species versus a Neanderthal versus a Denisovan versus a chimpanzee. And that was better than nothing. I mean, we clearly have one of the biggest brains based on the encephalization quotient. But plenty of birds do, whales do, chimps are pretty big. They're fairly big compared to their body size. So it was very crude until gene sequencing came along, and now it's a lot easier. And I know I get into some of the genetics about it, but you can map genomes now between us and other apes and Neanderthal fossils and Denisovans, where it becomes much more accurate, and scientists know, geneticists know which certain genes are involved in brain expansion and neuronal migration. And but it was interesting to see that trajectory. And then you can do a lot, starting in about the 60s or 70s, you can trace the rate of change in DNA and mitochondrial DNA, which comes through the maternal lineage, and see how rapidly we evolved in many different capacities, including brain size and brain function, compared to, say, a chimpanzee. So I think it's really only been as you know, like in the last, since the sort of the genomic revolution of the past few decades, that it's gotten much more accurate. These phylogenetic trees of where we came from and who were, what other species we're related to, have gotten far more accurate. Whereas 50 years ago, it was just crude fossils. How big is one species brain versus another? And a lot of that some of it is held up and some is not. And the tree gets more accurate every day, basically. And so it's still a murky science figuring out where humans came from, but it's really getting a lot more accurate than it has been.
Very interesting. The genetics, the DNA sequencing, as you know, has been a revolution in the past 5 to 10 years with these next gen sequencing approaches that allow even fragmented DNA in fossils to be sequenced and then reconstructed into a whole genome. So like you said, the Neanderthal genome is known, and many of these fossils are giving amazing information. Your book prompted me to watch a lot of different YouTubes, including Carl Sagan, who's my hero back in the 70s, but including his 40-second condensation of all of evolution. I highly recommend that. Just Google Carl Sagan and evolution. But other things more recent, I learned about, there's a neurologist named Christopher Walsh at Harvard who runs a developmental neurology center, but also an evolutionary neuroscience connection. I don't know if you've met him or talked to him.
I haven't talked to him. I know of him, but I haven't talked to him.
But his specialty is childhood genetic disorders that lead to brain malformations. And interestingly, like one specific example, there's a gene called Notch, or not, one called Notch2. And the word Notch, by the way, comes from the mutant fruit fly that has an abnormal notch in its wing, but they share the same gene that we use it for our brain more, they use it for their wing, but the gene's been conserved. But what they found was that humans who have a gain of an extra copy have an abnormally large brain, macrocephaly. Mm-hmm. And children with a loss of a copy have a small brain microcephaly. And then interestingly, that led to an idea that this gene might have been modified or duplicated in other ways during evolution to get to that larger brain. And I think they're starting to find evidence for that. So I think it's a cool connection between biomedical research and evolutionary research. So they mentioned they've looked at orangutans and great apes, which do not have this extra copy of a notch-like gene. And then when you move to Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, they found it. So it's a really neat model for connecting modern biomedical research to evolutionary science.
It is, yeah. And then I mean, I get into the genetics a little bit in the book, and yeah, there are, well, as we've talked about or emailed about, you know, traits like evolving a cortex, that's got to be very polygenic, meaning so many genes are involved in that, and so, and environmental influences and ecological influences. But there are a few, and Notch, and I didn't know that it came from the fruit fly, so thanks, Jim. That's a good fact. But the Notch genes, SRGAP2, there's a handful of genes where they seem to have duplicated in the hominin lineage, so the human lineage. And yeah, as you say, other apes don't have them except for Neanderthals and Denisovans, our other very close cousin. And they often have duplicated around the times of big changes. So when Homo erectus comes around 2 million years ago. So I think sometimes the papers or the press play them up as these really important genes that made our brains really big and allowed, you know, us to thrive. And I think probably there's some degree of truth to that, at least in researching it. They both, Notch and SRGAP2, actually slow down brain development in the womb. Neurons can take longer to migrate, which means they can make more synapses, more synaptic connections, and contribute to those trillions of synapses you mentioned. And you know, that probably is true. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think there's probably hundreds or thousands of genes involved in why we have this big, you know, prefrontal cortex that allows us to do this interview and sign into Zoom. But yeah, there are a few that have a really clear genetic signal as being quite important in just letting our brains really develop and thrive. And Notch is certainly one of them.
It's sort of surprising that single gene mutations can have pretty profound effects on brain development. And another story that you mentioned in the book is the FOXP2 gene in related to language ability. You want to expand on that?
Sure, that's an interesting story too. So the linguist Noam Chomsky, like many decades ago, proposed that only humans have ever had, Homo sapiens have ever had really complex language, the symbolic verbal language that we have and enjoy and communicate with. And even though he's not a biologist, he proposed that it was probably due to a single mutation, a point mutation, 50 or so thousand years ago. And that you know, that would mean that probably Neanderthals couldn't really communicate verbally too well. And then in 2002, a paper showed that this FOX gene, FOXP2, it suggested that this might be Chomsky's gene. I think they analyzed 30 related people, that 15 of which had a severe language impairment, and all 15 of them had a mutated form of this gene. And so it was concluded in the early 2000s that this is that gene, that you need a functioning copy of this FOX gene to speak. That's since been debunked. I mean, they've done subsequent studies that you don't need it. This study only had people of Caucasian and Asian descent. And if you look at globally, the population, plenty of people don't have a version of it, and they obviously speak. So it's probably important in language in some people, but again, I think language probably evolved. And I talked to Steven Pinker, who I'm sure you're aware of through email and phone about this, about how any complex trait like language is going to be polygenic. It's probably going to follow a Darwinian course of many different pipes, like you mentioned the building analogy. You know, probably Homo erectus had some form of language that was more complicated than a chimpanzee. They know that Neanderthals had a particular situation of their hyoid bone, in their voice box that basically shows that they could probably talk as well as a human from 100,000 years ago. And even monkeys are their voice box is set up to speak. So it was probably a very gradual thing. Australopithecines, 4 million years ago, probably had a proto language. Homo erectus, a better proto language, and then we get to, I don't know, 100 or 200,000 years ago, and most of the scientists I talked to assume that we were talking in a pretty complex way. By then, as we had, we were sitting around the fire talking in some proto language, if that makes sense.
Fascinating. Gosh, we have a lot of good audience questions coming in, but I guess we'll get to that soon. I think we have more to talk about than we can fit in an hour, but that's a good thing. Why don't you turn me on to several scientists who hadn't really listened to or talked or read, because they're totally out of my field. One is Simon Baron-Cohen, and who happens to be the cousin of Sasha, everyone knows.
Borat, yeah.
Cousin of Borat. But Simon is a psychiatrist, and he calls himself an evolutionary psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist, and in understanding of autism and the spectrum of autism as it relates to evolution. And he's got a lot of fascinating ideas. Of course, it's a whole new world about understanding autism. It has both genetic component, environmental component, obviously, but he makes some predictions that are interesting, like that if the autism spectrum includes certain abilities that are greater, if you want to call it, than the average, for example, mathematical focus on three-dimensional shapes and very attention to detail, that should favor those genes in populations that are in engineering and science and programming. And he made a prediction that places like Silicon Valley, and then he has another example of the Silicon Valley of Holland, which is Eindhoven, would have a higher percentage of autism in the children. And so far the data supports that, but of course you could probably find holes in his argument. What do you think of that whole field?
So including this came out of exploring whether or not experts think that natural selection in the biological sense, not cultural evolution, but biological evolution, is still happening to any great degree. And so many people, most of the biologists I interviewed said yes, including Steven Pinker, including a lot of big names in biology or psychology and biology, but to a much smaller degree than culture, because cultural evolution is so much faster now than biological. But then one of the ones that kept coming up was the Simon Baron-Cohen idea about autism. And so they call it's called a microevolution. So is our genome changing in any great way? Our collective genome across the globe, is it really changing all that much? And the idea of certain people, certain populations centering around a certain geography kept coming up. And this is his big theory, that it's, at first it sounded like his brother's movies. It was like outlandish, and I almost didn't want to touch it. But then there was some data behind it that people with autistic traits do tend to be a little more skilled at mathematics and analytical careers, and rates of autistic traits are higher in places like Silicon Valley. And so his prediction is that as those people meet and pair off and have children, you are going to see a change in the genome in that area. So it's a regional microevolution. I'm not an evolutionary biologist either, so who knows? But the data for now does support it. It's an interesting idea, and I do think it does seem like natural selection is probably happening still. Certainly with atrocities like genocides and wars, if you wipe out a big piece of the population, the genome of the global genome is going to change. It's going to be, the scales are going to be tilted in terms of what alleles, what variants are in there. So I do think it's much slower than culture. And then I came up with one theory completely on my own, which has no scientific data. So don't take this too seriously. But I was thinking about, I was asked a lot while researching how the new digital culture and virtual communication and kids texting and TikToking instead of interacting, how's that going to change genomes? And the one sort of thought experiment I came up with was that how we partner off, how we mate, and who we decide to have kids with is probably going to be influenced by meeting on Tinder or meeting on an app versus in person. If you're a shy person that would never go to the party or go to the bar to meet somebody, but you're fine being on Tinder behind that fourth wall, you might be a little more confident and meet someone you never would have, and vice versa. So I do feel like the digital form of socializing and dating and meeting people could really have an influence on where the collective genome goes, and that's a completely unscientific theory. So
Mhm.
don't cite that anywhere. But yeah, that was very interesting. Just the whole question of whether we're still, biologically evolving. And I think it's still up in the air, but I tried to speculate on where it might be going.
Cool. I know we need to get to audience questions, but I had one thing to bring up because we thought it would be an interesting tie-in to your and my worlds of medicine, neuroscience, neurology, neuropathology, and evolution. And not my idea, but it's in the literature. We ask questions like, why do humans develop Alzheimer's disease and other mammals don't? Even primates that are non-human primates that are kept alive a long time never get the equivalent of Alzheimer's, either by quote dementia or looking at their brains. They do get some amyloid, but they don't get the other. And there's this really interesting hypothesis, evolutionary, is that, and this is for my dad, who's an infectious disease specialist, and I think he might be watching, but the idea is that, hey Dad and Mom, the beta amyloid that forms these plaques actually has antimicrobial properties, and the laboratory made this hypothesis and proved it in the lab. So it has a benefit that protects the brain from infection, both from bacteria and viruses. But then as time evolves, these clumps of abnormal amyloid do bad things to neurons, even though they protect you earlier in life.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a cool idea. It needs more testing, but it's been proven to some degree.
That's very cool. I mean, I've read, and I wrote a few pieces, I think, for NPR about this infectious theory of Alzheimer's, that it's initially an infection you might get as a child, even whether it's a herpes virus, like, cold sore virus, gingivitis has been linked with it. And then this immune inflammatory cascade is set off for years, if not decades. And the amyloid, right, it's antimicrobial. And in the evolutionary sense, as we briefly discussed, we didn't live long enough. And this is the common hypothesis. We didn't live long enough until 100 years ago to even get Alzheimer's, right? We only lived to be 35 or 40. So things like Alzheimer's and diabetes, these chronic disorders didn't appear until we had modern medicine. But yeah, I was curious, because you're much more of an expert on this than me, why do you think it was conserved in the evolutionary sense? And you think you buy into the infectious theory?
I don't know enough. I know it's hard to detect, very low copy number of viruses in autopsy brains, and you get a lot of false positives.
Right.
But it's still compelling. I think that the biggest pressures on evolution, as you've talked about in the book, are starvation and infection compared to what we face today. And so thinking about that is really important.
And I think that's relative to other chronic conditions that don't involve the brain as much, but can, like diabetes. When you only live to 35 and you're in the plains, you eat as much sweet fruit as you possibly can. So we're really programmed to want sugar and to want fatty meat from the gazelle and to want oysters, and now we're stuck with living a lot longer. So we still want that Twix bar because it didn't matter when we only lived to be 40, and now it matters when you have an epidemic of obesity and diabetes. So it's a different world we have to navigate. But yeah, incredibly interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. I guess I should get to some questions. I see in the chat box that I have questions, and we also had some previously submitted. And well, one of them you sort of, I think you've already just, it says, do you think the human brain will continue to evolve? And if so, in what way? Any more words on that?
Yeah, I think I just to reemphasize what I said, I think based on talking to actual geneticists, that it is probably biological evolution in our brain is evolving, and certainly will continue to do so. I think that cultural evolution and psychological evolution, based on how our brains respond to being on screens 12 hours a day and how we communicate socially, will have a collective effect on our psychology and, how we communicate, how we interact as a social species. Primates are incredibly social, all of us, except for maybe lemurs. I don't know if they're social, um, but I do think cultural evolution will really be the the dictate of where we go as a species, which people like, Yuval Harari, you've read Sapiens, I know, Jim, like where we're going, I think it will be more of a matter of culture and how we learn to cooperate or not, than biology.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So another audience member asked, will we be able to develop other senses? We already have 5, maybe someday 6 or more.
That's I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that, but it would be interesting. Maybe if Elon Musk has success with linking up the brain to the machine,
Hmm.
we'll develop something. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jim? I'm not sure.
It's hard to imagine the evolutionary pressure that, at least in our current civilization, that would favor, a new sense. Obviously, it would make sense during other
Pun intended.
more stressful times in evolution, that obviously, smell and taste and
Yeah.
I mean, we have senses. We actually have more than 5 senses. Some people say we have a vibration sense, which is different than touch. We have
Right.
warm and cold sense, which is different than touch. And so even in the somatosensory domain, we actually have several distinct senses with different sensory receptors in our skin.
Right.
And interestingly, they can be tickled by certain chemicals, like, those Szechuan peppercorns that make your tongue and mouth buzz. It's actually hitting a vibration receptor that it somehow weirdly got evolved to do that. But
I love those. My wife doesn't like them at all, but
I love them too. I give them to every person who doesn't have them. You try this, try this.
me too.
We have a lot in common.
Yep.
Here's a question I have not even heard of this book, but if you haven't, we shall pass. It says, I'm curious to hear thoughts about Lisa Feldman Barrett's new book, 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. And she argues against the notion that humans have a primitive lizard brain. Can you talk? Is that something you've heard of?
I think I listened to her on a podcast. I didn't know her, but I listened to her on a podcast, and she seemed incredibly smart. And I think the idea was Paul MacLean, this scientist in the 60s, I believe, developed the triune brain model, basically saying that we have 3 segments to our brain, which we sort of do, as you know, the reptilian brain, which is like the brain stem that drives all our vital processes, breathing, heart rate, the paleo-mammalian brain, which is the limbic system, so our emotional centers like the amygdala, the hippocampus, and then the neo-mammalian brain, which is basically our cortex, the big prefrontal cortex that allows for complex thought. And that kind of lingered for a few decades, if I'm remembering right, and people misinterpreted it as being, if you're fearful, just your paleo-mammalian brain is firing, your amygdala. If you're thinking about a math problem, just your neo-mammalian brain is firing, your cortex. And that's been debunked because obviously all these brain regions are connecting and interacting all the time. And that's basically what I think she was talking about, that our brain evolved, all these structures evolved together. So the new ones would interact with the old as brain evolution occurred. I'm pretty sure that's what she's talking about. But don't quote me.
Okay. Another audience member asks about another author, and I haven't heard of this author, but I've heard of the concept of self-domestication. He says, what did you think of Richard Wrangham's hypothesis of domestication shaping modern humans' brain? I know you wrote about this gene that's linked to this idea of self-domestication among humans. What did you learn about that?
That I'm familiar with because I actually visited Dr. Wrangham Richard at his office at Harvard and had read I read all of his books. He wrote a book on how fire was important to us, why males are violent and females are not. And this is his theory he's been working on for a long time that's really caught on in anthropology, that it didn't always pay off to be the alpha male and be really violent in human evolution. So, chimpanzees are incredibly violent. The rates of just violence and sexual abuse, just terrible. And then in us, obviously humans can be terrible people, and that's a fact, of course, but we're far less violent. We're much more benevolent. We're much friendlier. And so his idea is that we self-domesticated ourselves through natural selection, that sometimes being kinder to your community, being friendly was actually beneficial. And that's probably happened in our bonobo cousins who are very friendly. And yeah, so that's a big idea in anthropology right now.
And some questions that, here's a very general question. How can we keep our brains healthy? It's a tough one.
I like to go to the Alzheimer's researchers for that one, because we don't really have, as you very well know, we don't really have any treatments to preserve our brains. There's no treatment for Alzheimer's that actually is curative. There's a lot of symptomatic or treatments, and really the only effective measures are all lifestyle. They're all preventative. So and diet. So Mediterranean diet with a lot of seafood and healthy fats mixed with exercise, mixed with socializing is hugely important and shown to delay cognitive decline. And then just challenging your brain to anything that you don't already do. So, taking up new hobbies, taking up a new sport, taking up a new, if you already do crosswords and you're good at them, that's great, but once you're good at them, they're not gonna do anything. You have to take up something else. So for now, that's what the neurologists are recommending is just this combination of lifestyle interventions until we really figure out the pathology behind something like Alzheimer's. And maybe, like you mentioned, the infectious theory is where we're going with that. But for now, yeah, that combination of lifestyle factors, I would say.
As we're getting closer to the end, there was a previous question. I don't recall the exact words, but somebody asked about in your subtitle, you have CRISPR. And of course, the question is, will we, should we, can we, or will we, and should we modify the genes that determine brain connectivity and function or disease? And, this person asked, will this happen? And are there too many political roadblocks? What did you learn about the CRISPR-Cas application to neuroscience and neurologic disease?
Sure. I mean, it's one of these technologies that whether or not it should happen, I think is just going to happen. In the right hands, it's out there already. A researcher in China had already used it and got in big trouble for it, and through the Chinese government, he had CRISPR is the hot genetic engineering technology where you literally can edit someone's genome, an embryo, a fetus, or even an adult. They've done it in adults for hemophilia and for blindness. So for the most part, if it's used right, you could really cure a lot of disorders that are caused, single monogenic disorders caused by a single gene or a few genes. You can literally go in and edit that gene out, and that's great. And that's already happening. I mentioned hemophilia, so scientists can do that. I think that after this incident in China, a lot of the ethical committees around the world, especially in the States, Francis Crick, Collins at the NIH was involved in the sort of, the backlash. We have to rein this in a little bit. And, this really needs to be regulated, because in the wrong hands, we're going to get these worries of super babies and parents wanting particular traits in their children. And that's going to get very messy and very dicey. But I would be so surprised if it still didn't happen on both the positive and negative side in 10 or 15 years. And there's an amazing new book by Walter Isaacson about CRISPR that just came out too, and that is far more successful than mine. And it's just kind of a good expose of where CRISPR came from and where it might be going. But I think it's going to be pretty commonplace in the next few years. And certainly with COVID vaccines, these mRNA vaccines, CRISPR has been helpful in developing those. So there's a zillion potential good uses for CRISPR for sure.
Yeah, I did some reading too. It's and it could affect evolution if the CRISPR-Cas is used on a embryo or fertilized egg, because that would be carried into the next generation. So that would certainly, and that's that's what this Chinese scientist did. He modified the receptor for the HIV to protect those kids from a father who is HIV positive. That was the rationale. But that gene will then be passed on to the kids, which will be presumably resistant to HIV, interestingly.
which on paper sounds like a great thing to do, but it was done so prematurely without known risk of side effects or adverse events. And, I think, yeah, I mean, that perhaps it was a noble pursuit, but I think that just has to be done with so much caution and regulation because it's just too early.
Right. But I think, like you said, there are monogenic diseases. The classic kind would be things like Huntington's disease, Fragile X, where you have a repeat expansion, as you know well. These diseases were a repeat of nucleotides. So CAG, which is normally present in 3 or 4 copies in a particular gene, for reasons that are really interesting, get expanded to hundreds or even thousands of copies. And in the laboratory, scientists have shown they can splice out that abnormally long repeat in neurons in a dish and even in mice. So, and that would not be passed on to the next generation since it's done somatically
Right.
in brain cells. And that seems like a wonderful, amazing application.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I think if it's used right, it has so many applications for sure.
So we have only a couple minutes left. And I think most of the questions have been covered. Someone asked about, again, this sort of gets back to the autism spectrum question. They said, do you think social anxiety was the wild type and extroversion the anomaly during evolution? What do you think?
That's a fun one. So wild type, I'm assuming in the biological sense, just means the in a natural environment, the normal genetic state or the normal state. I would probably think both. I mean, I've thought a lot about the evolutionary conservation of mental illness. Why do we still have mental illness? Why wasn't that, selected against? And I think obviously anxiety, when in check, is incredibly useful. I mean, it diverts us from predators. It provides safety. And then if it goes too far, we have a mental, you're in the DSM. And then on the other side, depression is also associated with a lot of positive traits, empathy and caring for other people, as long as it's, not too far on the depressive spectrum. And what was the other one? Extroversion? Or he mentioned extroversion?
Right, would that be the anomaly? Like, do we all start off being introverts and then there was a mutation that made one person extrovert? In a society, you need both types in a functional human society.
I would think so. I would think if you're the right kind of extrovert, you're probably going to be the leader of your society, and your genes are certainly going to live on, and you might be a great person. But I think a certain amount of anxiety would also be wild. I feel like that it's some amalgam of all of our psychological traits. We're probably the wild type, I guess, and any of them that they're extremes can cause problems. I'm winging this one, but that's my sense.
Yeah, that's a fascinating area. I think we're pretty much out of time, so I will turn it over to our hosts.
Yes, thank you both. Thank you, Dr. Mandel, and thank you, Dr. Stetka, for sharing your expertise and your time with us this evening. It was a fantastic program. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the UVA Office of Engagement for their collaboration in making tonight's event possible, and for all of you for joining us. I hope you have a great evening.